Hey guys, welcome back to the Deconstruction Zone. My name is Maggie, and you probably recognize me if you've been listening to the past couple episodes, but Danny is not here today. He is in the most magical place on earth currently with his family. Gotta say I'm a little bit jealous, but in his place, we have the fantastic Dr. JT Young here guesting on the podcast today. JT is the executive pastor at The Well, which is the church that Danny pastors at and I attend. And yeah, welcome, JT.
Thank you so much. So it's an honor to have been asked to guest host this podcast.
Well, when the cat is away, the mice will play. So we can talk about whatever you want. Anything that Danny usually wouldn't allow. I'm just kidding. Danny, I feel like people joke about this type of thing, the cat being away, the mice will play. Danny's chill. Like, he doesn't not let us talk about stuff.
Yeah, Danny's not, just to continue the analogy, Danny's not chasing the mice.
Nope.
Try to get us. We all play together. We get along pretty well. So
yeah.
But yeah, Danny's in Disneyland with his fam and his kids, and he's making content out there. I texted him yesterday and said, does it ever get exhausting just like cranking out content 24/7? And he said no. So
dang.
But we're here. We're creating a different type of content in his stead. So
yes, and we are in the second most magical place on earth, St. Louis, Missouri.
St. Louis, Missouri, tropical. Yeah, this heat feels a little tropical at the moment, but we're here.
Fun. So, well, JT, I wanted to have you on specifically for these episodes because I think that you have a really, really interesting area of expertise, which is broadly, and I might totally butcher this, so correct me. And actually, no, I'm not even going to try. How about you tell us what your area of expertise is, and then we can chat about it.
Yeah. That's very generous. The title of expert carries a lot of pressure, but I do my best. So I graduated last year with my doctorate from Eden Theological Seminary here in St. Louis, particularly in public theology. And more or less, I would say I'm trained as a practical theologian and a pastor. I had a professor in my master's program that described himself kind of this way with different titles, but I would say I'm a practical theologian by training and a pastor by calling. And so my doctoral work broadly focused on moral and ethical formation in the local church. And happy to talk about that more if that's interesting. But broadening out, zooming out a little bit, a lot of my research has focused particularly on the intersection of race and religion within predominantly white mainline Christian churches. And so I published my first book 2 years ago, which was designed as kind of an introductory primer to the history of race and religion in America. And my second book is currently under contract with Cascade, which is going to basically be a revamped, rehashed, edited version of my doctoral dissertation, but hopefully made much more readable and accessible and exciting for a wider audience than my doctoral committee. But so that's kind of broad strokes what I've done academically for the last several years.
Yeah. What made you want to study that, or what kind of got you on that path?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I guess speaking particularly about race or particularly about moral formation.
Actually, yeah. maybe let's talk about moral formation first, because part of me wonders if people who are maybe just kind of beginning their deconstruction journey, or are maybe more like casual consumers of religious type extracurricular stuff like this, may hear like moral formation and ethical formation of the church and think to themselves, isn't that what the church is supposed to do? So why is there kind of this extra layer on top of it? So if you could kind of talk about that for a second, what got you down that road, and then also speak to kind of the race relations part of it as well.
Sure.
Or I guess race history of race relations in St. Louis specifically.
Yeah, St. Louis specifically. So looking at moral formation, I mean, this project or this avenue of study was really traces its roots back for me. Like my interest in this really traces its roots back about 10 years when I first started pastoring. I did my master's degree in New Jersey. While I was working on my master's, I was pastoring a small rural United Methodist church in a kind of a 20 miles north of central Jersey, and really a place that was pretty overwhelmingly conservative, a place where I really fell in love with pastoral ministry, but in a place that I spent 2 years pastoring there, and I don't know that I could have spent a third. It was a difficult place. And I started pastoring in the summer of 2016. And then, so I was there for about 6 months when the 2016 presidential election rolled around. And it was me and one other seminary student who were like co-pastoring this church. And here we were, like two super green pastors cutting our teeth in ministry, trying to navigate this like weird political dynamic in the church where Trump had won this election, and there was this like huge influx of both non-denominational evangelicals as well as conservative mainliners who had come out and supported Trump and started making some really interesting theological claims about Trump. And so out of that season, I talk about this kind of like in the intro to my dissertation. There was one gentleman in particular who I had like said a prayer or something like the Sunday after the election about like praying for the people that are like afraid in this moment, like in America or whatever. And he had emailed me and he was like really up in arms about this and like really like upset that I said this prayer, that like people shouldn't be afraid and like this is a good thing, blah blah. And so I invited him in and we like sat down and had coffee, and I was like listening to his perspective on why this exercised him so much. And he had said kind of like in this offhanded way, I don't super remember the context, but he had said something about like Jesus was a capitalist and he wanted people to like pull themselves up by their bootstraps, blah, blah. And I mentioned this like in the intro to my dissertations. It was kind of the moment I realized just how far gone American Christianity had taken Jesus into some like other realm that was never part of the conversation.
Yeah.
And so that started me kind of down this path of like, what is our role as pastors? You know, like there are pastoral duties and responsibilities that pretty much every pastor has, in terms of pastoral care, caring for the sick, caring for people who are in moments of crisis, these kinds of pastoral care things. But then what's our responsibility in terms of preaching, in terms of teaching, in terms of shepherding small groups, whatever, to help bring people down a path into further and further alignment with the love, character, and ministry of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, we have to do some work up front in churches to define what does that mean. I mean, obviously for this gentleman, he had a very different idea of who Jesus was. And so we have to disentangle who is Jesus. And then we have to start talking about what is the church supposed to be? What are we supposed to be doing? What are pastors supposed to be doing? And so that's kind of what got me started down this path. And I mean, I'm happy to talk more about the doctoral research I do in that realm, but I was really coming into all of this. I mean, underneath all of this, I mean, this was 2016. Within a year, 1 to 2 years before, being from here in St. Louis, Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson. And so I saw, I mean, this unrest was happening as I was, pretty much making my transition across the country to go to seminary. And I had really, and like I talk about this in my first book, that I was raised, and I think maybe this might resonate with people of like our generation, that I was pretty much raised that like we were in a post-racial America, and that like racism existed, and then Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech, and then like racism was done, right?
Yep.
Like this is what I was taught in school. Like it doesn't sound right.
Racism is over. Yeah.
Racism's over.
We solved it a long time ago. Obama was president. Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
Post-racial America, race is dead, racism is dead.
We're the great melting pot.
Yeah, all these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then, like, Michael Brown gets murdered. And then my initial instinct, and I was like a college kid at the time, my initial instinct was like, well, this kid did something wrong, right? Like, police wouldn't have done this if this kid didn't do something wrong. And then people that I really trusted, mentors and teachers and things, we were having conversations. I took a class in college that was called Race, Rights, and Religion after Ferguson, where we pretty much spent the whole semester studying Martin and Malcolm, and all from them to contemporary America, and Michelle Alexander and the new Jim Crow and all these things. And that really was like a moment where the scales fell from my eyes about race in America. It was like, oh, this isn't resolved. And like I've been lied to. And we, like a whole generation of people, have been lied to about the state of race in America. And so that was kind of in the background percolating as I came into pastoral ministry, as Trump rose to power, as rhetoric around race and immigration and all these things really started to become, heavily to the forefront of our political dialogue in America. And so the question that just continued to keep me up at night from church to church as I moved my way through my career over the last decade was, one, what's our responsibility as church leaders, as pastors, as people in the church, whether we're volunteer leaders or on staff or whatever. But also, what would it look like if every person in the largest religious tradition in the world was moved toward issues of justice and liberation and grace and mercy and love and all these things? Like, think of how different the world would be. And so that really became like my life project was, helping churches, helping pastors, helping move congregations and people further into alignment of the character of Jesus and his ministry in the Gospels, and trying to help people disentangle the current state of politics in America away from the history of authentic faith and ministry that we find in the Gospels. These things have become so conflated, especially in the last 100-ish years in America. And so just helping people kind of walk through how we got here, and that this reality isn't the only possible reality. There
Mhm.
different reality that could be possible. So that was a lot that I threw out, but that's kind of the background of what led me into this work.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I was gonna say something really sarcastic of like, well, it sounds like getting a doctor is really easy, and you really like focus on one thing. That was probably super chill, didn't take very long. Um,
Yeah, super
especially
chill.
here in St. Louis,
Yeah, I mean,
a
no
utopia of
St. Louis, no racism in St. Louis.
none. Yeah, none. Obviously dripping with sarcasm. But yeah, thank you for kind of explaining that. And I think the timeline is really interesting because something that I personally have experienced and I've heard from a lot of other people who have deconstructed too is that timeline is really similar. Like things really popped off in like 2015.
Yeah.
And now having read, some of the hits, the new Jim Crow, Jesus and John Wayne,
Yeah.
reading some of those works and seeing like what was happening in the background for things to kind of come to a head around 2015, 2016.
Yeah.
It's like, well, it couldn't have been any other way. Like this was where the path had been carved. Like this is where we were heading, which is so crazy. But something that really kind of popped into my head while you were talking is actually a Bible verse, which I had to look up. But the idea of like, so it's 2 Timothy 1:7, God giving us a power or a spirit of power, love, and of sound mind instead of a spirit of fear.
Mhm.
And something that I've realized in a lot of conversations around race in the church and politically, and a lot of just like general political conversations about, even like universal healthcare or foreign policy and, domestic foreign conflicts,
Yeah.
things like that. I have a lot of family members that are still very conservative. It is this overwhelming sense of fear of like, what is going to happen to us if things change? What's going to happen to me if, people who have historically been discriminated against aren't discriminated against anymore.
Yeah.
So I wonder, like, if you have also kind of experienced that, especially as in your role as a pastor, and how you kind of deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, the root of all of this is fear, right? Fear of the other, fear of not being the one who's dominant, the fear of not being in control, the fear of, whatever. And it really is, and I think fear of not being in control is really a key piece of this. And I think we've experienced this, and I think people who are going through deconstruction more broadly probably have felt this to an extent. Maybe you guys have talked about this in the past, I'm not sure, but the idea of letting go of the certainty that we feel in our beliefs, whether they are religious beliefs or moral beliefs or political beliefs or whatever, those things, give us meaning and give shape to our lives. And it helps us have really clean cut, crisp lines and delineations and organization of thought. And then when those things start to crumble, it gets really messy, and it's like a domino, right? Because it's all pretty intersectional in America at this moment, and just like oppression in general is pretty intersectional, and we can talk about that if you want. But especially for conservative Christians in America, and nothing is a monolith, but for a lot of conservative Christians in America are typically tend to side more politically conservative, morally conservative, whatever. And so when these things are so intertwined, when one domino goes, they all go.
Yeah.
if one goes and they all go, and you're looking at these like this, this battlefield of like dead bodies of things you used to believe, and now you don't super know what to do. You don't know what to believe religiously, politically, morally, ethically, whatever, historically. That's a huge task to try to rebuild.
Yeah.
And it's especially hard when, as a lot of our deconstructing friends have found, that when that happens, when you start asking questions, when you start to lose faith in certain institutions and certain things, those are often deal breakers for communities. And so you're ousted from community. And so you're doing it alone. And so, for the people that are, differ from me politically or religiously or whatever, there was a time in my life when I was really angry and really bitter about the way people, how they didn't understand this, or they weren't, I don't know, like whatever. And now I just feel, I feel sorry for people that have such a fragile ecosystem of beliefs and are so afraid and are so fragile that they can't question anything, that there's been so much crystallization around their beliefs, and so that's part of what I was hoping to do in my doctoral research, or one of the things that I was looking at was, how do we, and part of the impetus for my first book on race and religion was, how do we introduce this conversation in a pastorally responsible way, that we're walking with people through this. We're not like coming in and just dropping a woke liberal bomb and then walking away and just letting people like deal with it. But like, how can we walk with people through these conversations, through these transformations? How do we let people know they still have seats at the table? And that's because if we can eliminate that sense of fear, you're not going to get ousted from the community. Jesus still loves you. You're whatever. Then it's a whole lot easier to take a step back and critically examine some of the things that we've blindly held to for so long. Because there's the things we were afraid of they're not of concern anymore, right? We don't have to worry about losing community or whatever. We have people to help us reconstruct something meaningful. So yeah, I think fear, in whatever way that manifests itself, is a really important piece of the puzzle that we always have to be paying attention to.
Yeah. I think for me, something that helped really overcome a lot of fear, because I've talked about on the podcast before, I was raised very conservatively. Yeah. And so I think I got really lucky in the sense that a lot of these big pop culture moments, like big like national zeitgeist moments, happened when I was a young adult or a teenager. And so like during that time, developmentally, you're already kind of going through this change of like, you're able to reason abstractly better. You're able to think about things a little deeper. You're able to move past some of that kind of like black and white thinking, all or nothing type of stuff. So like, I think I got really lucky just like time wise that a lot of this happened when it did in my life. Cause my brain and my personality was already kind of like going through some changes. But I think for me, like the greatest tool to combat this fear that I was like programmed with has been compassion, and like learning to have compassion on other people, but also compassion for myself, and realizing that like because once fear takes over, shame can take over. And I think some people that fear of being ousted from a community is very real, but also like some people can't think like, oh, well, if I change my mind, if I admit I was wrong, that shame is so unbearable.
Mm-hmm.
But like having compassion for yourself, that like it is okay to learn and change and grow and be different than you were before, that has been really powerful for me too. So like when I think back to how I treated gay people at my high school, I'm like, oh God, like that shame creeps in. And just like, I wasn't outright bullying people, but I was definitely in the like hate the sin, love the sinner camp, which is still really toxic and damaging.
Yeah.
And I think back, I'm like, God, that's so embarrassing. But having compassion for myself, and now having compassion for people that I affected and damaged, by having that line of thinking, is how we move forward. So, fear is so powerful. There was something else that I was kind of thinking about while you were talking, and I feel like I've lost my train of thought on it now. So maybe it'll come back to me. Okay. This is one thing. So talking about moral and ethical formation in the church, an apologetic tool that I was taught growing up was that without the Bible, there would be like no ethical or moral framework for humans in general. And that we would all just be like murderers foaming at the mouth and like killing each other and pillaging and thieving, and there would be no order.
Right.
I now do not believe that to be true. And there's a lot of really great moral and ethical frameworks that are outside of the Christian Bible, or Christianity in general. But yeah, if you could kind of just like get into what that looks like for a church, of like, is a moral and ethical framework for the church, does that come entirely from the Bible? Does it come from other philosophies? Am I like totally off base thinking that it has to come from something? Like, could you just kind of explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's so funny to think about, people are so, when I say people, I mean like the people I argue with on TikTok or whatever. They're so like Bible. And like big fan of the Bible. Love the Bible.
For sure.
But it's like, we can't ignore the fact that historically other ideas influenced the way things were written, and that ideas formed and that made it into the Bible. Like, we have a lot of evidence of early Greek philosophy making it into the Bible. And like, other pagan religious traditions that were taken and reframed and utilized for Christian and ancient Jewish ideas. Like, so I think the first thing is like, we need to demystify this a little bit. Like, I think truth can be found in a lot of places, and there's truth in the Bible. There's also truth in a lot of places. And so we are, I think, limiting what we ourselves can learn and be formed by if we just read this one book called the Bible. But we're also limiting what God can do and where God might be speaking into the world. So that's thing number one. Now, that being said, the concept of this, of like a biblical Jesus-centered moral framework, is for me pretty compelling, and more or less compelling for others, and that's totally fine. But this idea of a framework of morals and ethics based upon this concept of love God and love neighbor, no greater love than to lay down your life for your friends. Like, this idea, generally and broadly expanded. I have this, you can't see it, but over here on the side of my desk, I have a framed Time magazine cover from 1949 that has Albert Schweitzer on the cover, who was a 20th century philosopher and theologian. and greatly influential in my own life and my own development. Schweitzer was a theologian, got his doctorate, was teaching theology, felt compelled by the Jesus of the Gospels to go and care for the poor and the outcast. And so left his cushy academic job, went back, became an MD, got another doctorate, went and started a hospital in the Congo, and was like a missionary doctor in the Congo for the rest of his life. And somewhere along the way, got another like doctorate in music. Like he had 3 doctorates. He was just a genius.
Love.
And while he was in the Congo, was searching for this like broad, kind of what you're describing, or maybe not describing, but like searching for a broad universal concept of the ethical. And eventually came up with this concept of what he called reverence for life. And there are some like twists and turns in there, but essentially from the most macro to the most micro conception of life, having reverence and respect, from not taking a human life to not stepping on a flower if you don't have to, right? And he claims, the reason I bring this up, I spent a winter break while I was in seminary working through a volume of his letters that he had written. And he talks about how he understands this concept of reverence for life to be the moral and ethical demand of the gospel writ large across the entire cosmos. And he defines this as like responsibility without limit for your neighbor. And that like really stuck with me, like responsibility without limit for your neighbor. That you have a responsibility to care for the people around you, with no limits, that even like the limit of your life is not a limit. And he finds this in the person of Jesus. And so that was all really compelling to me. Because I mean, there was a time like when I was pretty heavily deconstructing that I was okay letting go of all this, that I was ready to go. I could have been an atheist or a Buddhist or whatever. But I couldn't let go of this conception of Jesus. It was just so compelling to me. And so as I worked through kind of these questions of moral formation, it really led me to start thinking really critically about what does it mean to, love without limit and to have responsibility without limit. And when you start asking that question and you start reading things through that lens, there are a lot of really interesting answers to that question throughout history. We have really, really pacifistic thinkers who lived this out in a way, and we have others who were not that way. Like I write in my first book, I have a chapter about James Cone, who is the father of Black liberation theology in America, passed away a few years ago. In one of his like seminal works, he was kind of addressing this concept of the birth of Black liberation theology. And he talks about how he says Black liberation theology was born when slaves realized that killing their masters was doing the work of God. That's a pretty radical claim.
Yeah.
And then you have others, that are on the complete opposite end. That violence should never be employed. Toward the end of revolution and liberation and all these things. And somewhere on both ends of the spectrum and all in the middle, we have this Jesus language being employed. And so, I became really enamored with how do we how do we reconcile these seemingly incompatible versions of Jesus? But also, how do we find truth in all of them? What is the truth we find in these various strands and traditions? And in all of them, the thing I come back to is, kind of Schweitzer's formula. Is what does it mean to have responsibility without limits for the people around us? And that's really become my drumbeat for churches who are engaging in this work. Is like, that's the question we have to ask. And not only we have to be asking that question for people who are actively being oppressed and discriminated against based on race, gender, immigration status, whatever. We also have to have responsibility without limit for all the people we don't agree with. We have to have love without limit for the oppressor.
Yeah.
We have to start asking the question about, what does the gospel have to say to them? And so, that when I think about like a moral framework, I think that's really the center, the Jesus that teaches a love and responsibility without limits, is really the thing that everything else revolves around. That whenever we have a seeming conflict, we come back to that center and we interrogate, what does this center have to say to that problem?
Yeah.
And so that's how I've tried to the best of my ability to understand kind of these moral and ethical demands of the gospel and the way we put it into practice today.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is so tough. I think that at this point in my life and in my like deconstruction and faith walk and practice, that's the part that I struggle with the most, is how do I apply this compassion that comes so easily for the oppressed? How do I apply that to the oppressor? Yeah. And I think the answer is going to be different for everybody. There's no like boilerplate prescription that you can write out for it. But yeah, and a lot of philosophers and other like people who have dedicated their whole careers to studying that type of like ethics, have more to say about it than me. But it's hard. It's really, really hard.
Well, and we're all tied into it, right? Like none of our hands are completely clean.
Totally. Oh, yeah.
And I think that realization alone is a huge eye-opening thing, right? Mm-hmm. Like, even if I'm not, passing policies that are actively hurting people,
right,
I'm still complicit somewhere in the system to make it happen. And even if I try to eradicate my complicity, I'm still a straight white man in America with an Ivy League education who receives all that privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still benefiting. Every time I'm pulled over by the cops, I'm benefiting from that privilege because I'm not afraid of getting shot the way that a lot of my friends of color are. And so there's something to be said too about how, we can try to wash our hands of it as much as we can, but there's always going to be some residue that we just have to deal with. And we just have to be okay with the fact that it's there and do our best to, claim responsibility, even if you don't think it's fair, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even like, I didn't own slaves and I didn't, whatever. Well, no, but you're still benefiting from a history that greatly privileged you, your archetype over others. And so, it's kind of like the end of Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. Like, we kind of all did. We're all kind of doing it.
Spoiler alert for Murder on the Orient Express.
Spoiler alert for a book that's been out for 100 years.
I know. I'm joking. But yeah, no, I think you're totally right. And this definitely is something that I think maybe took me a little bit longer to learn, because I do have one aspect of my existence and identity that is oppressed, generally speaking, which is like I'm a woman.
Yeah.
But just because you have one aspect of your identity that is discriminated against or oppressed in some way doesn't mean that you don't have other aspects that aren't. Like I'm able-bodied, I'm well-educated, I'm white. There's a lot of things that a lot of positions of privilege that now I picture as like, well, this is a gift. Like I got lucky in these ways, and I get to use these parts of my identity now as a tool to champion the marginalized and people who weren't as lucky as me.
Yeah.
Because I'm listened to more. I am allowed in spaces that other people aren't allowed in. Like I can be the inroad. I can be like the shock trooper to let other people come in behind me because I'm allowed. And I think that is part of the responsibility that I have to other people. But yeah, it takes a long time to get there. And I think it's something that I have to continually learn and unlearn a lot of other things. So
yeah.
Well, yeah. So I guess if you have any final thoughts, maybe for people who are, picture in your head someone who's listening to this episode and this is like news to them. They're listening to this and they're like, what the heck? This is either a load of woke nonsense or like, oh my God, what are these people talking about? Or someone who's just really wrestling with a lot of the topics that we've touched on today. What would be maybe like a word of advice or kind of a final thought for that hypothetical listener?
Yeah, we kind of touched on this earlier, or I think maybe you touched on it, Maggie, about, the allowance to change and to admit that we had made a mistake or that we, believe differently now than we did before. And there often is a lot of shame tied up in people changing their minds about XYZ, fill in the blank. But and I write about this. I have a chapter in my first book about Malcolm X, and I write about this particularly in relation to X, about he had a great transformative experience. I mean, he was pretty broadly anti-white people, and then became a Muslim, went on a Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca, which every Muslim is required to do at least once in their life, and came back pretty transformed, having met a lot of white people and non-Black people who were far different than the kind of stereotype of the white oppressor that he had been dealing with in America. And I talk about in there that we do violence to people by kind of pushing them into a metaphysical mold in which they're not allowed to change or grow or transform. And that goes for us, that goes for people who disagree with us, that goes for whomever.
Yeah.
So I would say, I mean, for those who are like wrestling through this or who are, on a journey of transformation in any number of ways, whether it's religiously, spiritually, politically, whatever, that one of the greatest gifts that we are afforded as humans is the ability to grow and change, that there is a journey that we're on, and that we don't do right by the journey if we try to stand still. And so, and all that being said, I reference this. There's this Hindu thinker in America passed away a few years ago named Ram Dass, and he had this like famous quote that said, "We're all just walking each other home." And I really love.
I've heard that before. Yeah, I like that too.
We're all just walking, right? Like we're all on the journey. And we find ourselves again and again on the journey, right? We find our friends again and again on the journey. We find truth and beauty and all these things on the journey to home, wherever home is. And so, if you feel like you're losing something by changing, I mean, sure, you're probably losing something, but there's a lot of journey left. You feel like you're losing God, you'll find God on the journey. If you feel like you're losing, a community, you'll find community on the journey. And so I would say, take a deep breath and just embrace the ability and the freedom you have to change. Because there's a lot of people, myself included, Maggie included, Danny included, who have come out on the other side of the change and still are here to tell the tale, and I think are better for it, hopefully. So that would be my parting piece of wisdom.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it. I love talking about stuff like this. It's got me really excited just like thinking about, I don't know. It makes me feel better sometimes about the state of the world, knowing that there are people in it like you who want to make the world a better place. So we are actually going to record another episode now and chat some more about your work and more about race and all the things that entails. So for our listeners, stay tuned for another chat with Dr. JT, and we will see you guys next time.
Yeah.